Tidak, saya menganggap itu tidak besar.
Bagaimana mungkin tidak besar? 1 juta orang dibunuh atau lebih.
Itulah dia politik.
Imagine what it's like to confront the men who murdered your brother.
Saya tanya Adi, Abang Awa itu jadi organisasi di Medan.
Pikir nggak usah, itulah.
Bilang karena ada lah galapan.
Now imagine that the murderers are some of the most powerful and celebrated members of society, free to boast about their crimes with impunity. That's the premise of Joshua Oppenheimer's new documentary, The Look of Silence. A companion piece to his previous film, The Act of Killing, The Look of Silence confronts the perpetrators of the Indonesian genocide of 1965 from the perspective of its victims today, who are determined to learn the unspeakable truth of their past. I spoke with the film's director, Joshua Oppenheimer, about the psychology of mass killers and how his camera is changing the course of a nation. Hi, I'm Todd Cranen for Reason TV, and I'm here talking with Joshua Oppenheimer about his new movie, The Look of Silence, which is, I saw it a few days ago, and I'm still letting it wash over me. I'm still getting over it. It is a very powerful work. And Joshua, can you just tell us, just give us a brief sort of summary about what is this film about for people who don't know?
So The Look of Silence follows the brother of a victim of genocide, but it's a 1965 Indonesian genocide where the perpetrators have been in power ever since. And the brother of this victim is a man named Adi, is an optometrist, and he goes and he confronts all of the men involved with his brother's murder, while testing their eyes, tries to get them to take responsibility for what they've done, in the hope of being able to reconcile with them. And what unfolds is this kind of portrait of an abyss of fear and guilt that divides everybody in this society, this sort of portrait of impunity and what it's like for survivors to be forced to live and to rebuild a life surrounded by the still powerful men who killed their loved ones, what it's like for them to live essentially for half a century in fear.
Your main subject, Adi, is really an amazing person. I think you could not have had a better lawyer who, as an inquisitor, to ask these really hard questions. I mean, basically what he's doing is he's confronting the very people who murdered his brother in many cases.
Abang saya dibunuh itu, Pak. Tapi berhubung karena pembunuhan ini di bawah komando Bapak.
Bukan kita juga.
Kan Bapak yang bertanggung jawab karena Bapak sebagai ketua komando aksi pada waktu itu.
Where did you find someone like that, of such a perfect inquisitor like that?
In 2003, at the very beginning of my exploration of the terrible present-day legacy of the genocide in Indonesia, I was working I started this journey on a remote oil palm plantation where I'd been helping the plantation workers make a film of their own back in 2001, 2002. And in this region, there was one victim whose name was synonymous with the whole genocide, and that was Adi's brother, Ramli. And that's because Ramli's murder was the one murder in that region that had witnesses. Tens of thousands of people had been taken to rivers, killed, allowed to drift out to sea, and their families never told what happened, which meant that the families couldn't mourn, couldn't grieve, because they couldn't even say that their loved ones had died. They would just say they hadn't come home yet, for decade after decade. And what they were able to do was to talk about Ramli, because his murder was proven. There was a body, there was a grave. And so gradually, over the decades, Ramli had become a kind of synonym for the genocide as a whole in that region. And inevitably, therefore, I was introduced to Ramli's parents. And they wanted me to meet Adi, saying they had this son right after the killings, whom they conceived as a kind of replacement for their murdered son. And they said, if you want to understand what we lost, you must meet Adi. He looks like Ramli. He talks like Ramli, acts like Ramli. He's a kind of reincarnation of Ramli. And they called him to the village, and I met this man who wasn't as afraid as everybody else, because he was born after the killings, hadn't experienced directly the horror of the genocide. In a way, he was sort of from another generation. And he was trying to figure out what happened to his parents, to his family, to his community, to make everybody the way they were. Everyone was so afraid they hadn't even told him what had happened. And he latched onto my filmmaking to find answers to those questions. and in a sense to figure out who he is. That was already 12 years ago. And he started first gathering survivors to tell me their stories. After 3 weeks, the army threatened all of the survivors not to participate. He then said, don't give up, try to film the perpetrators. I spent 7 years filming the perpetrators, and he would watch everything I had time to show him. That led to the act of killing, and then in 2012, I returned to make the second film, which I always knew I would make. I knew it was always a pair of films. And in returning, Adi said, I need to confront the men who killed my brother. At first I said, absolutely not, it's too dangerous. But then Adi convinced me that he thought this was the only way that he could create a future for his children where they don't live in fear of the perpetrators. By visiting them, by breaking the silence, that he could somehow, because he's not out for revenge, he could somehow reconcile his family with the murderers of his brother.
That is amazing. How did you gain the trust of the killers as well? I mean, I think that is quite an amazing thing, because and I think as you recognize that it is unique in the history of documentary in a way that you're actually getting people in power who were genocidal perpetrators to admit to what they did and to even gloat about it.
At first, when Adi told me in 2003, please don't give up, after the army threatened the survivors not to be in the film, he said, please don't give up, try to film the perpetrators. I was afraid to approach the perpetrators at first. I was thinking, how will I get them to talk? Will they talk? I was devising very neutral questions that I could ask to slowly work my way around to what happened during the genocide. And I would approach the perpetrators trying that, but found to my astonishment that it wasn't necessary, that within seconds of meeting these men, they would open up about the worst details of the killings. It took, if you've seen my first film, The Act of Killing, gradually over time they open up about their feelings, their true feelings about what they've done. They start talking about their nightmares, and that involved building trust, to get them to talk about their pain. And they can only do so in a kind of faltering way, because to talk directly about their pain would be to force themselves to live with this unbearable guilt, to look in the mirror, wake up every morning, look in the mirror and be confronted with the image of a mass murderer. But so to get them to sort of start revealing these cracks between how they want to be seen and how they really see themselves, that took time, and you build trust for that in the same way that you would build trust with anybody, just by being present and open and trying to understand, not necessarily to excuse, trying to empathize, not necessarily to sympathize. But that's just how we human beings build trust. But simply to get the men to open up, which is and to talk about what they'd done, it took nothing. They would boast, and it is in a way in response to that and the impunity that evidences that I made these two films.
You do see this incredible change in these killers, in these murderers, from boasting and gloating about their horrible achievements, and then there's that sudden glimmer of just the very beginning, a faint realization of maybe this isn't such a great thing, maybe this is actually horrible. Are you worried a little bit about humanizing these people? That these people are going to maybe elicit a little bit of sympathy from the audience?
No, because in fact every perpetrator is human. And if we want to understand how human beings do this to each other and how they live with what they've done, we have to try to understand them as human beings. So I think that not only am I not worried about humanizing these people, that is the task of these works. That doesn't mean that I'm trying to excuse or elicit sympathy, but I am trying to elicit empathy.
Aku mendatangi Bapak ini kalau untuk maksud yang negatif, maksud jelek itu nggak ada. Tapi ini lebih kepada pengungkapan sejarah. Tidak punya agama, tidak percaya Tuhan. Itu nonsen itu, Pak.
Tapi ini soal saudara ini kadang-kadang larinya ke situ, heran aku.
And you're absolutely right that in both films, in different ways, the perpetrators start to realize what they've done is wrong. Of course, in the act of killing, Anwar, through repeatedly dramatizing what he's done, the dramatizations become a kind of mirror in which he sees himself, and his illusions about himself start to crumble or fall into crisis. In The Look of Silence, it's almost more subtle. Adi comes to and more shattering as a result. Adi comes and meets these men, and he himself refuses to look at them as anything other than human. He has this humanizing gaze. He comes to them, and this was his point from when he first proposed meeting the perpetrators. He said, I'm going to come, and if I go to them, not out of revenge, not out of anger, showing that I'm there to listen, and if they can acknowledge what they've done is wrong, then I can forgive. They will greet this, he felt, as some kind of long, unconsciously hoped for opportunity to acknowledge what they've done is wrong, to stop their terrible boasting, and to find forgiveness in one of their victims' families. And so he thought they would welcome this. And I told him, when I realized we could do this safely, I told him that actually, I think you coming and seeing them as human, as the human beings that they are, will throw them into crisis, because they will have to meet your humanizing gaze, and they will realize that you're a human being. By extension, your brother whom they killed was a human being, and all of the people they killed were human beings, and consequently what they've done, that they've done something terribly wrong, and therefore all the lies they've told themselves so that they can live with what they've done, to justify what they've done, will fall into crisis, will start to shatter, and you'll leave them angry, defensive, defensive, and in a way defenseless, kind of naked, and they'll start scrambling for new armor, denials of responsibility amidst threats and anger. And in that sense, just as the dramatizations in the act of killing are a kind of mirror in which Anwar, the main character, confronts himself, Adi's questions are a kind of moral mirror in which these men are forced to see their own conscience. They become terrified, not of Adi, not of me, but of themselves.
You try to get at their motivations, and they give several motivations, right? They say, well, the victims weren't religious enough, right, at one point, or they had bad morals, and they sort of leap from one justification to the next. But I can't really. I'm trying to understand, I guess, what makes ordinary people commit those kind of acts. What is their real motivation underneath all those justifications?
Yeah, I think you're asking a very important question. You're implying kind of a truth about my films, which is that they are about the present. That it's very difficult to discern the difference really between a present-day justification, a present-day excuse, something they've told themselves afterwards so they can live with what they've done, and their motivation at the time. But I think that from working with many perpetrators, from filming with many, I think that there's some common traits. I think, first of all, a failure of empathy, an exorbitant selfishness, and something we all are familiar with, which is an ability to be incited to participate in a group which is doing something that we privately might feel is wrong. I think all of us have experienced that, where there's a group doing something, we're expected to join the group, or we're pressured to join the group, and we know that we see the group doing this, we know that what the group is doing is something we don't feel comfortable with, but we figure, well, if everybody's doing it, it's probably okay. And I think that kind of incitement, if you have if the group is acting with the blessing of the state, with the blessing of authority, it's easy to incite people, particularly if you're rewarding them. And the perpetrators I've filmed, none of them felt if they didn't participate they could be killed or they could be punished themselves. They were promised promotions, they were promised money, they were promised power and prestige, and so they betrayed their individual morality to do what they've done. And all of them required, at the moment of killing, at the moment of participation, they needed different forms of help so that they could distance themselves from the act of killing while they were killing. In the act of killing, we hear that Anwar Congo, the main character, was smoking marijuana and watching movies, coming out of the cinema, intoxicated by his love of his favorite film heroes, dancing his way across the street, for example, after watching an Elvis Presley musical, and killing people happily. The men in The Look of Silence would literally be intoxicated. They would drink so that they wouldn't have to be present in that moment where they are fundamentally betraying their own humanity and committing the act of killing.
I find that interesting that you say that, because what you're saying is that individually they are moral people, that they had a good upbringing. It's this somehow group mentality, like the Stanford prison experiment or the Milgram experiments at Yale, that sort of brought out this other thing in them.
Primo Levi said this very important thing about perpetrators of the Holocaust. He said, there may be monsters among us, but they are too few to worry about. What we really have to worry about are the ordinary people. And Every perpetrator I filmed lives their life in sort of manic flight from this pall of guilt and shame that follows them everywhere they go. And for the most part, during their waking hours, perhaps they outrun it. But when they stop to sleep, it catches up to them, and it insinuates itself into their dreams, and they awake with terrible nightmares. And yet, because these men have never been removed from power, they still have available to them the excuses justifying what they've done. They still have available a victor's history that says what they did was heroic and worth it. So they do the human thing that I think you or I would do if we'd done something terrible that was eating us up inside, but which we'd been told by the most august authorities in the land that we'd been told was right. They seek to take these bitter and rotten memories and sugarcoat them with the sweet rhetoric of the victor's history, which celebrates what they've done. And that, of course, accounts for the sort of most surreal mystery we see in both of my films, which is why are the perpetrators always boasting about the most unseemly details, things that, okay, even if they're proud of this, how can they boast about that? Well, they boast about the terrible, the grisly details of killing, because those are precisely the most bitter memories for them to swallow.
Can you talk about the reception in Indonesia for a little bit?
So before the act of killing came out, with very few exceptions, the media was either silent about what happened or would celebrate the heroic extermination of the Indonesian left. And that ended with the act of killing. The act of killing, you could say, came to Indonesia like the child in the emperor's new clothes, forcing Indonesians to acknowledge something they've always known, which is that this regime, the present-day regime, is a corrupt, violent, and built on fear, and that underneath, and that it's based on impunity for genocide, really. And that's something that the public now is talking about, debating in response to the Oscar nomination for the act of killing. The government of Indonesia said, look, we know what happened in 1965 was a crime against humanity. We know we need truth and reconciliation. We just don't need a film to force us to do this. So they sort of tried to dismiss the film. But nevertheless, it was wonderful, because it was the first time they ever admitted it was wrong. And you can say, therefore, the act of killing opened the way for The Look of Silence, which has had a much wider release in Indonesia. It's distributed, in fact, by two government bodies, the National Human Rights Commission and the Jakarta Arts Council, something unimaginable for the act of killing, which began its life in secret. The first screening in Indonesia was held in the largest theater in the country. There were billboards around Jakarta announcing the screening. 3,000 people came. The venue could seat 1,500, so they put on two screenings. Adi came to both screenings and received a 15-minute standing ovation. Yeah. A month later, the film came out around the country with 500 public screenings on the first day. We're now at over 3,500 screenings. And you can just say that into the space opened by the act of killing, The Look of Silence has come also like the child in the emperor's new clothes, this time pointing out something else, another thing that Indonesians already knew but couldn't talk about, namely the prison of fear in which every Indonesian is sort of condemned to raise their children. And it's made it impossible for people not to address that and not to call for truth, reconciliation, and some kind of justice. And that's, in fact, the debate which has ensued from the release of The Look of Silence has prompted the government to introduce a Truth and Reconciliation Bill, which still is woefully inadequate, but is a really important first step. It's a milestone, and it's something that the public, the human rights community, can lobby to have improved.
Among the many other amazing things about this movie are the credits. Anonymous is credited over and over and over again, gets a credit. Why are there so many credits for Anonymous?
To protect Adi and his family's safety in the wake of releasing the film has taken a team of 5 people full-time and another 20 working in different capacities part-time. And because it's dangerous to put your name on the production of my films, the team, the Indonesians who help make my films remain anonymous. And these are people who change their careers to do this work. I mean, they're filmmakers, human rights lawyers, heads of NGOs, university professors who initially took a 6-month sabbatical because we had no idea that this would take a decade to make these 2 films, and found that they ended up spending a decade risking their safety, knowing that it was unsafe to take credit for their work until there's real change in Indonesia, because they felt it was that important. And you see as the film ends, you see that essentially the entire Indonesian crew remains anonymous.
And I'm wondering, too, if you're optimistic about the future in Indonesia as well, because early on in The Look of Silence, right, you have that unforgettable scene with the classroom, right, and you see the next generation of Indonesians being taught. No, the old regime was wonderful and terrific, and all the communists needed to be killed and to be purged.
The school curriculum that you see taught in The Look of Silence, and actually also in the director's cut of The Act of Killing, is still what's taught in Indonesian schools. So in response to The Look of Silence, the Indonesian Association of History Teachers has come together and created an alternative history curriculum that involved for upper secondary students teaching both of my films. But it says, it's essentially a way that teachers can say, look, this is the official story, and now this is the truth. And that's an important step forward, but the government needs to change the curriculum. And it's a good example of the kind of struggle ahead. There's real resistance to changing the official history, because if the government changes the school curriculum, the state is officially acknowledging that the wealth and power of the perpetrators and their oligarch proteges is essentially the spoils of murder and plunder. And the most powerful people in Indonesia do not want to be exposed as criminals, when now they're seen as the legitimate leaders of the society. So Indonesians are still being asked to repeat and asked to learn these lies, but now they're saying this is a lie.
Would you agree, is this a film that only a foreigner could have made?
Yes, absolutely. And yet because of it would be too dangerous for an Indonesian filmmaker to do this. And very early on, when Adi, the other survivors around him, and the human rights community as a whole, after encouraging me to film the perpetrators, saw my early footage with them and said, continue to film the perpetrators. You're onto something so important, because anybody who hears the terrible way in which these people are speaking will be forced to acknowledge that in an awful way the genocide hasn't really ended, because the perpetrators are still in power and people's lives are still being ruined by fear. When they said that, I felt entrusted by the survivors, the human rights community, and Adi to do a work that they clearly could not safely do themselves. So yes, only a foreigner could make this work, but at the same time, the film is making the impact that it's making inside Indonesia, and I would even argue outside of Indonesia, because it's not made from a foreigner's perspective. By my collaboration with my Indonesian crew and my fluency in the Indonesian language and the years I spent in Indonesia, I used all of those things to create a work that would feel, for an Indonesian, like a work of Indonesian cinema. One of my anonymous crew members, he was a production manager, cinematographer, or second camera person, sound recordist, assistant director. He became my main creative sounding board, just to ensure that every decision in the shooting and in the editing would feel wholly authentic to an Indonesian. And that, of course, makes the film a mirror for Indonesians. It makes it universal. People see the film, they don't see their world being explained to outsiders. They just feel immersed in Adi and his family's life. And I think the same is true for foreign viewers. If the film had a kind of screen or layer of exposition, of kind of journalistic or historical exposition between the viewer and what's being witnessed, where things are being explained, there would be a kind of distance, and the film would be inevitably a kind of, like most of the documentaries that we see, especially dealing with atrocities, the film would be a kind of window onto a far-off phenomenon that we knew nothing about and cared also little about, being explained to us. Instead, by making the film wholly Indonesian, just something that I could only do as a foreigner, but with the help of an Indonesian crew, the film for even a foreigner becomes a wholly immersive experience, and it becomes universal. It becomes about all of us.
You said you cannot go back to Indonesia. You're too fearful at this point. And yet at the same time, you've in both of the films, you've only really hinted at American involvement in the tragedies. I'm wondering if that affords you an opportunity to talk more about that in the future. I don't know.
The bulk the evidence about what the United States did, why we did it, how we did it, remains classified. And I've been working with lawmakers. Senator Tom Udall introduced a sense of the Senate resolution in reaction to the act of killing, demanding that, or saying that 50 years is too long not to call a crime against humanity a crime against humanity. And if we want there to be truth and reconciliation inside Indonesia, we had better acknowledge our own role in this too, otherwise we're hypocrites. And he's called for the declassification of all of the documents which would reveal exactly what we did and how we did it. So there's a kind of, there's secrecy. That's a problem for talking about what the US role was. Enough details have come out that we can see that are pretty damning, that we can see that the United States was an active participant in the genocide. The other thing I'd say is that, first of all, we have a perpetrator who's just boasted about ordering the killing of 600 people, look right at the camera because he's looking right at me and I'm right behind the camera, consequently looking right at the audience and saying that he ought to be given a cruise to the United States as a thank you because it was the United States who taught him to hate and kill the communists. And then we see an NBC documentary where we see not only that the genocide was reported as good news, but also that they say that Bali is now more beautiful without the communists, but also that, it was reported in detail in the United States, but as something positive. But we also learned that Goodyear, a major American corporation, is harvesting the latex for its tires, the soles of our shoes, and for our condoms, using slaves taken from death camps, which is precisely what German corporations did on the periphery of Auschwitz just 20 years earlier. And this should give any viewer of The Look of Silence pause, leading us to wonder to what extent is the so-called the struggle of the so-called free world against the communist world, to what extent was that the real reason for U.S. involvement, or to what extent was that an excuse or a ruse or a pretext for wholesale and murderous plunder?
Could you just tell us, when is The Look of Silence coming out?
So the film's out already in New York and Los Angeles, and on Friday, the 31st of July, it will start coming out around the rest of the country.
Outstanding. I really wish you the best of luck. Thanks a lot, Josh.
Thank you.
For Reason TV, I'm Todd Cranen.